really what the sanctions are trying to target are the individuals closest to the leadership to exert pressure to change the direction of where the country's going.
A while ago on the programme, but half an hour ago, we were speaking to the Times' Anthony Lloyd, who was comparing for us the absolute devastation that's been caused to Ukraine's economy versus Russia, which has obviously had many sanctions, many levels of sanctions imposed upon it, but seems to be managing. What is your assessment of the impact of sanctions on Russia?
It's fairly difficult to isolate and understand the impact on it, across the whole country. I mean, we've seen a massive increase in the number of sanctions really around the world in the last 12 months, right? So we track sanctions on a daily basis, and we've gone from more than 20,000 in some of our databases to more than 40,000 in the last 12 months, and on average added about 50 sanctions a day. And obviously the goal of the sanctions is to really put pressure on the Russian economy, and as we saw in today's announcement, also suppliers to the Russian army and things like aircraft parts and radio equipment. But yes, I think sanctions take time to work, and they're obviously just one other aspect of the war.
Is there an extent to which you can intensify sanctions too far and too fast? How strategic is this, I suppose, in terms of the actual logistics of imposing sanctions?
It's really the first time sanctions have been used at this sort of scale, right, in any conflict. So this is a bit of I guess, a first-time experiment, given the scale that we're seeing. And then the challenge that we help organizations with, companies with, is how do they actually implement the sanctions, right? So we see a press release from the UK government today. All of the, that's going to impact a number of organizations and companies, often financial organizations, but also manufacturers, as we can see today, who've now got to understand what does that mean for them. So the names have to get onto the sanctions list, and then we have to work through how do we stop moving money to those individuals. There were a large number of new individuals named today as well. And it's not only the individuals, but it's the companies they're involved in. So one of the things people often don't realize is that the names on the list are really the tip of the iceberg. And, in the early days, a year ago, when we saw some of the oligarchs sanctioned, many of them were involved in literally thousands of companies. And so if you're a company doing business, you have to understand, are any of those companies, somebody that you bank, somebody that you move funds to, somebody that you do trade with, and then you've really got to stop doing that business. But the first challenge is understanding who has actually been impacted.
There are wider things here as well, in terms of, I'm thinking of dependence on gas from Russia, for example, where Europe has really looked to decrease dependence on gas from Moscow, and that's been really quite successful. Russian gas represents just over 12% of the gas required in Europe. And that has been a direct consequence of this as well. But I don't suppose we would label that necessarily as a sanction. That's just been a sort of conscious effort. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that is fair to say. That has been a very, very much a conscious effort. But I do think that the amount of imports from Russia have dropped very significantly in the last 12 months into the UK and other European and Western countries.
What about compliance with sanctions then? Because that surely is the key thing, as we're kind of guessing at here, is that you can announce sanctions, you can impose them, but they need compliance at the other end, if you like. I've been reading in the last couple of days about concerns, I suppose, around Russia's ability to evade Western sanctions. This from the Financial Times. The EU and its allies are investigating a surge in exports to economies in Russia's vicinity as they try to prevent companies from evading sanctions. Are these sanctions that have been imposed on Russia can they be evaded easily?
The challenge is understanding all of the complex corporate structures, right? So definitely when you implement sanctions, there are going to be attempts to evade them. And, that's actually kind of what we do at Moody's as part of our business, is to try and help people understand the ownership structures, right? So who owns these different companies, and the different company structures. We'll often see 10, 11 layers of companies, and sometimes shell companies set up to really hide who's behind these companies.
Mm.
And so it is kind of an ongoing kind of game of cat and mouse, to be
Yeah.
honest, to try and kind of lift the veil and look behind all the different layers and understand who you're really doing business with.
Yeah.
And that's a huge challenge for British businesses, right? To understand who they are doing business with, and to make sure they're not running afoul of the sanctions regulations.
Of course. Intensity of sanctions, I suppose. Is it in anyone's interest to simply run Russia into the ground at this point? Is there an argument that you should just crank up sanctions to such a point that it is utter devastation? Traditionally, the logic suggests that the most vulnerable suffer most in that situation. But actually, if you're looking to weaken a country, shouldn't you just weaken them?
Most sanctions programs are about, changing the course of the country, right? And how do you exert that pressure on the Russian leadership, right? There's millions of people in Russia, obviously, and really what the sanctions are trying to target are the individuals closest to the leadership, to exert pressure to change the direction of where the country's going.
Thank you so much for watching. You get extra points for making it all the way to the end of the video.
And if you want to see more from me, Chloe and Callum, you can join us every Friday to Sunday on Times Radio from 6 a.m.